The way that the Elite's working this term is Monday night, which is tonight, we'll be doing game analysis and strategic play. So we're going to be going through analysing a game and looking at strategy. On Tuesday night, Carl's going to be working with you on end games, and on Thursday, Frank is going to be working with you on tactics and calculation. So tonight, Monday night, is usually going to be Robert Jamieson. He's unavailable tonight. He's got one of his tennis meetings. So I'm going to be showing you a game that Anatoly Karpov played. And Karpov is one of Robert's favourite players, which is why I chose this game. Because as Anthony likes to talk about, Karpov loves waddling. And so we're going to look at some waddling in this game here, because I know that Robert always likes to use that word. He says, oh, the king waddled over here and the bishop waddled over there. All right. Andrew, if you're not going to be here tomorrow, that's fine. All the lessons are being recorded as normal, and they'll be online for you to check out afterwards. All right, we're going to start off with this game back from 1973 in an interzonal tournament. Now, the way that you become a world champion, like Karpov became the world champion, the way that that happens is step one, you have to play in a zonal tournament. And a zonal tournament is basically all the best players in your region, not just in the country, but in the whole region. Australia is very lucky. We've got a really easy region. We used to be in the Asian region, and we kept getting crushed by people like India and China and all those other really good countries. And then they created another zone called Oceania. So we're now in our own little oceanic zone, and all you have to do to get into the World Championships these days is beat all the New Zealanders, the Fijians, the Tongans, the Solomon Islanders, the Papua New Guineans, wholly for people who don't play a lot of chess, obviously apart from the New Zealanders who are pretty good. Once you've won the zonal championships, today, straight into the World Championship knockout tournament. Back in Karpov's day, after winning a zone championships, you then had to go to an interzonal tournament. And an interzonal tournament was where all the best players from the zone championships came through and played like this big knockout tournament. And only if you finished in the top 8 players in the interzonal tournament were you then able to go on to play in the World Championship knockout matches. And then you would play 8 players, you'd play a match, usually anywhere up to sort of 6 games in the match. You'd knock out from 8 to 4 to 2 to 1, and that one player would get to challenge the world champion to try and become the next world champion. So not an easy thing to do, right? They put a whole heap of obstacles in the way of anybody who was hoping to become a world champion. They made it very, very difficult, and there was a lot in favour of being the world champion already, because you imagine you're the world champion, you sort of just kick back and relax for about a month, prepare for your opponent, and your opponent has to go through all these grueling matches of zonals, winning that, interzonals, candidates matches, knocking everybody out, and then finally they get to challenge you as the world champion, and you're nice and rested, and they're exhausted after dozens of games at a top level. So not an easy thing to do. This game that Karpov is playing, he's white. His rating at the time is about 2750, so he was one of the best players in the world, obviously world champion eventually, and he's playing against another Russian grandmaster who's by Karpov's standard pretty weak, only 2650. So with a rating of only 2650, Karpov as white starts off pawn to e4. All right, we're going to have a look at this opening. Michael, I'm going to give you a chance to talk really early on because I know you like to talk. What's this opening called?
This is just one of the openings I don't know.
Okay. Anthony knows what it is. Nicole, do you know what this one's called? Hang on, let's see if we can get... Nicole, do you know what this one's called?
Is it the French defense?
Very good. This is the French defense. Tell me, now that you know the name of it, Nicole, what is the strategy for the French defence?
I'm not sure.
Okay, no problems at all. I'm just going to mute you again so that we're not distracted. The French defence, and Anthony, I know you know, that's why I keep putting down your hand. The French defence, the strategy is for black to play, and you'll see after the next moves, to play a pawn chain into the centre of the board. Okay. So here we have a pawn chain in the centre of the board, allowing white to get 2 pawns next to each other, controlling the centre. So you would instantly think, well, hang on, white's got the better position. White's got the strong pawn centre, and black's got a more defensive strategy. Now, the reason that black wants to do this is because black wants an unbalanced position. Black wants to have lots of pawn breaks, and he doesn't want to give white very many good pawn breaks. And I know that most of you guys have, perhaps with the exception of Nicole, been to a few of the lessons that I was doing last term about pawn strategy and how important pawn breaks were. And the main thing for black in the French defense is he wants to get pawn breaks. He wants to try and encourage white's pawn to move forwards in the middle of the board so that black will have pawn breaks possible on c5 and on f6. So he can advance his pawns from the side of the board forwards, swap off those pawns that are in the middle for side pawns, and at the end be left with 2 pawns in the middle of the board, and white will have no pawns left. Not in the centre anyway, because he'll be swapping off his centre pawns for edge pawns. So that's basically the strategy for black, is to try and get pawn breaks, get rid of the pawns from the centre of the board, swap them off for edge pawns, and then dominate the centre of the board. Right? White's strategy is to try and use the advantage that he's given on the first few moves to control more space, because he's got the nice wall of pawns in the centre, and to play a more attacking game. Right? So we're going to see how Karpov chooses to do this here, with knight to d2 to start off with, protecting it. Black straight away launches out pawn to c5, like we expect, wanting to swap off white's centre pawns for his edge pawns. And Karpov chooses to play a very positional line by exchanging off the 2 pawns in the centre of the board and just developing his pieces. He's going to try and leave black with an isolated pawn in the centre of the board. And we're going to talk a little bit, once the C pawn and the D pawn swap themselves off, we're going to talk about why an isolated pawn can be good or bad. I'm going to see black's going to have an isolated pawn for this game. All right, so knight to c3. Bishop develops himself for white, so Karpov's just developing his pieces as quickly as possible. But even now on these first few moves, there is a plan for every single one of white's moves, okay? Because white knows that he's going to leave black with that isolated queen's pawn in the centre of the board. All right, as soon as black plays bishop to d6, now is the time to exchange pawn for pawn. If he'd swapped off pawn for pawn before, black could have just played bishop recaptures pawn, and that would have saved him a whole extra move. Waiting for the bishop to move, now when you play pawn takes pawn, black has to move the bishop again, and he's wasting 1 move. Now, this is the amazing thing about Karpov, is that Karpov never seems to play like a brilliant, spectacular, sacrificing attack. Karpov only ever gets a small advantage. He's just gained half a move. He made black move his bishop twice to get to c5. Right? Tiny advantage. Tiny advantage. You'll see he gathers a whole heap of other tiny advantages, right? And the tiny advantages all added together end up being a massive advantage. Right? And that's Karpov's style of play. It's a very strategic positional style. He knows you don't have to go and win the game in just the first few moves. You don't have to launch a crushing attack. You just have to get your pieces in better positions than your opponent. You just have to gain half a move here and half a move there. Small advantage here, a small advantage there. And when you add them all up, it adds up to eventually a massive advantage. All right, after that exchange, we've now got black with an isolated queen's pawn in the center of the board. That is a pawn that's got no friendly pawns on either file next door. So that pawn can never be protected by an enemy pawn. Now, there are good and bad things about it. All right? Who wants to suggest some good or bad things about the isolated queen's pawn? Anthony, I'll give you a chance to go first. Tell me something good and something bad about the isolated queen's pawn. Hang on.
Hey, well, something bad is obviously it's an isolated pawn and can be easily attacked. But something good about it is that it allows for a very open attacking game for black. It gives a certain dynamic to his play, where he can actually work around the pawn and have some huge central attacks very early on, whereas white would have to defend.
Okay. All right. Let's hear something from Michael. Michael, what have you got to say? I'm just going to unmute you, and you can tell me what you've got to say.
With the isolated pawn, the bad things about it, like he said, is that it can be easily taken.
Yep.
Though maybe there's a few good things about it. Maybe the good thing is that it's, instead of being on the C file, it's actually on the D file. Mm-hmm. But maybe you could think of that as a bad thing, because maybe if it
Oh, we seem to have lost you there. All right, Andrew, have you got anything to say? Or Nicole, do you have anything to say about the isolated queen's pawn? Anything to say, Andrew? No, nothing from Andrew. Nicole.
Well, the bad thing is that there's 3 pawn islands.
Good.
Black.
Very good.
And the good thing is it's attacking in the center.
That's excellent. So I think we've basically summed that up pretty well to say that the bad points about the isolated queen pawn is that it does create 3 pawn islands, so it creates more weaknesses. A pawn that's not protected by another pawn is always weak, because if you've got to protect a pawn with a stronger piece, you're wasting the power of that piece. Like if we have to protect this pawn here, if black has to protect that D pawn with his queen and his rook and his knight and his bishop, that's a lot of firepower, that's a lot of attacking power that could be used somewhere else to be attacking somewhere else. Right? You've got to try to... Oh, Andrew can't hear you. Andrew can't hear me. Can everyone else hear me? Mean either. We've lost everybody. Put your hand up if you can hear me. Could you do that for me, please? Could you put your hand up if you can hear me? Nicole can hear me. Anthony can hear me. Oh, that's it. Everybody can hear me. All right. Not sure what was going on there. Thanks, guys. All right. All right, now I'll talk again. Hopefully we'll be back on track. Sounds like there was just a small dropout. I'll try and keep an eye on that. Maybe internet's slow tonight. All right, so what I was saying was that if you're wasting all of your strong pieces protecting a pawn, that's attacking power you could be using elsewhere. So an example I like to sort of give is, well, imagine that somebody gives you $10 and you think, oh, well, I'm going to put $10 in the bank. That's the equivalent of a pawn. All right, so you're going to put $10 in the bank, but in order to keep that money in the bank, you have to pay bank fees of maybe 90 cents a week. Right, that's like using a queen to protect a pawn. It's using a lot of money to protect something that's not all that valuable. Right, so within a few weeks, your bank account's empty. Right, there's no point spending money just to protect a very small amount. And it's the same thing here. If black has to spend all of his pieces to protect that D pawn, he's going to be wasting, their power. They could have been attacking somewhere else. All right, so that's the downside for black. That's what he's got to watch out for. But The advantage for black is that that pawn is in the center of the board. Right? It's controlling the middle, and so white doesn't have any control over the center of the board. That tends to lend a better attacking game for black. You've got more control over the center, can use the center to swing the attack left or right. So this whole game now revolves all around just that pawn. So even after, what is this, like 8 moves of the game or 7 moves of the game, right, the whole game is just revolving around just that isolated queen's pawn. Now, do you remember from previous lessons about a pawn structure, how can white really attack that pawn? How can white attack that pawn? Right, what's the first thing to do before actually putting a piece up to attack it? Anyone know what the strategy is going to be? Anthony, what's your strategy against the isolated queen's pawn?
Well, the first one would be to bring your knight on d2 to probably b3 and castle kingside.
Okay, why are you doing
to
that?
Let your bishop on c1 out and
okay, hang on a second.
Let your rook on h1 out.
Okay, hang on a second. When I ask for a strategy is an idea, right? It's not a move. It might be a sequence of moves, but it's always an idea. Right? What you're giving me is
my
moves.
idea then.
Yep. So what's your idea?
My idea then would be to attack along the d file.
Okay, attack along the d file. That's great. That's your strategy. That's good. I need something a little bit different than that. There is actually a more specific strategy that will be probably better than just the idea of attacking along the d file. Does anybody know what it is? How do you attack an isolated queen's pawn? All right, I'll tell you the answer. The most important square on the board is the square one step in front of that pawn. All right? White's plan comes in 2 stages. Stage 1, stop the pawn from moving forwards. And he's going to do everything possible to prevent that pawn from moving forwards. Step 2 is, like Anthony said, attack along the d file and win the d pawn. But the first thing is, before you start attacking along the d file, you have to stop that pawn from moving forwards. So some of the moves that Anthony was suggesting were good moves, but it's really important to know, to attack a pawn, you don't attack the pawn because the pawn will just move away. You attack the square in front of the pawn. And once you've attacked the square in front of the pawn, then when the pawn can't move forwards, the pawn can get attacked much more easily because it's got nowhere to run. All right, so White's next move was castling. Of course, great idea. Gets his king safe. And we're going to see that every move now for White is going to be all about stopping that d pawn from moving forwards. And conversely for Black's strategy is going to be to try and advance that pawn forwards or to swap that off. Because if he can swap off that pawn or advance it forwards, if he advances it, he gets more space, more attacking. If he swaps it off, he's still got a nice position in the center of the board, a stronger position in the middle, and he doesn't have that isolated pawn to worry about anymore. All right, Black's developing his pieces as well to try and get his king safe. Knight to b3, which was the move that Anthony suggested before. Of course, you can now see the knight's covering d4, the knight's covering d4, the queen's covering d4, 3 pieces covering d4, plus you can see, sorry, let's try that again. Plus you can see that the move that he played earlier on, bishop to b5, pins the knight so that that knight does not protect d4. So you can see he's piling everything up around that square in the center of the board. d4 is the main thing. First step, stop the pawn from moving forwards. All right, bishop to d6. Strategic idea for a bishop. The best spot for a bishop is always one step behind a pawn. This bishop behind the pawn can attack in both directions, left and right. It's sheltered from any attacks that White tries to throw at it from the front by the pawn that's right in front of him. Right, so it cooperates very well with the pawn. It also covers the squares on the side of the pawn, which are potentially weak squares because they're not protected by that pawn on d5. So a bishop one step behind a pawn is usually the best spot for a bishop. Okay, so that's why bishop to d6 is a good move. Starting also to a planned attack against the king side. All right, bishop to g5. Now, can anybody pick why Karpov played that move? Can anybody pick why he's playing that move? Bishop to g5. Michael, tell me why he's doing that move. Sorry, Michael, I'm trying to unmute you now. Okay, we've got it. Are you with me, Michael? Anthony?
Pawn again, because he's pinned the other knight that's defending the d-pawn.
Right, so he's doing that to pin the knight on e7, so the knight's not protecting the d-pawn now, is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Michael, did you have anything to say about that?
Oh no, but keep on dropping out and I can't hear most of the conversation.
Oh, it keeps dropping out a bit, does it? Tonight
Yeah,
seems to be a
keep on
bad
dropping
connection.
out.
Tell me, Michael, if you can, why that bishop moved to g5?
Well, maybe he moved there to pin the queen.
Yep.
Well, to pin the horse.
Yep.
And maybe he's trying to make him try to attack the bishop, but then it weakens his pawns.
Okay. Very good. No, good. That's two very good answers there, Michael. Very good. That he could be using it to just pin the knight, like Anthony says, so that that d-pawn is weaker. And he could be using it to try and lure those pawns on the king side forwards, because if black moves his pawns on the king side forward, it opens up his king. Two very good ideas there. I like them both. We'll see in a minute why white moved his bishop there, and it's actually not for either of those reasons. There's a third reason that he wanted to move his bishop there, and we're going to see that in a second. All right, black just castled, got his king safe. And obviously people can see that if the queen takes the pawn on d5, can anybody see why that's not a good move? All right, have a think about that. The queen takes the pawn on d5. The knight's not protecting it because it's pinned. Michael?
I was just wondering that maybe he's trying to go for a king attack by getting his bishop on the g.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Anthony's saying you lose a piece. How do you lose a piece, Anthony? I seem not to be able to hear you. Anthony, do you want to just type it in for us? Do a chat. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
Anthony, tell me why do you
Okay.
lose a piece if you play queen takes d5 now?
Well, after queen takes d5, knight takes d5.
Yep.
And then when bishop takes d8,
Yep.
Rook or knight takes d8, probably the rook takes d8, you've swapped off a bishop for a pawn.
Okay. Is that the best move for black, is it? There's another tactic. I'm just going to mute you. Queen takes d5, loses a whole queen. Bishop takes h2 check. Bishop takes h2 check, and then the queen's gone. All right? So just watch out for that. Anytime that that d-pawn looks like it's undefended, when you've got that bishop just being able to move away, so you've got to watch out for that one. All right. Bishop to h4 was white's move. Did you just see that? Hopefully you saw that move. He's moved his bishop backwards. Now, has that given you a clue yet why the bishop moved to g5 in the first place? Karpov's plan is not to pin the knight. It's not to advance those pawns. It's actually to try and swap off this bishop here, which he sees as his bad bishop, for black's good bishop. Again, that would be a tiny advantage. It's an exchange of bishop for bishop. 3 points for 3 points. So it doesn't seem like a big advantage. And yet Karpov is spending a bit of time, bishop g5, bishop h4, bishop g3, to try and swap off his opponent's good bishop. Right? That bishop on h4 isn't exactly a bad bishop. It's not blocked in by any of his own pawns. He just sees black's bishop on d6 as a very strong piece. It's in a perfect position for a bishop, one step behind a pawn. So his entire plan with bishop g5 was actually to swap off those two bishops, which is a bit of a surprise. You don't really think about that when he plays bishop to g5, that he's actually trying to swap off bishop for bishop. But a very clever plan, and one well worth thinking about, because he's slowly building up lots and lots of small advantages. Right? He made black waste a move with his bishop. Well, actually, the black bishop's wasted another move because he's had to go back to d6 from c5. He's going to swap off a good bishop for an intermediate bishop, not a good bishop or a bad bishop, collecting another small advantage. Right? Black's got an isolated queen's pawn. If he can't move that pawn forwards, there's another small advantage. And so eventually, by adding up all of these lots and lots of little tiny advantages, he's going to hope it ends up to make a really big advantage. All right, queen to c7 for black, piling up the queen and the bishop along that diagonal. And as expected, bishop to g3. What a great move. Bishop to g3. Trying to swap off those bishops. Now, probably black's best plan here is to try and fight for control over that really important critical square d4 in the middle of the board. Right? And the best way to fight for control over that square in the middle of the board in this position would probably be something like developing the bishop, pinning the knight on f3 so that knight doesn't guard the d4 square anymore. So that would probably be his best move. That would be his best plan. Right? He didn't do that. He actually played bishop takes bishop. I never take an opponent's piece. I think that's an important rule. Never take your opponent's piece. Like seriously, what's the point for black to take white when he knows he's going to get taken back? So in this game, he'll have moved his bishop 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and it's now just going to get taken. Right? So had he left his bishop there, white might have traded off bishop for bishop, but white would have been the one had to waste a move with a piece that's just going to get taken. Right? So I'm not a big fan of taking an opponent's pieces. In fact, in my games, I usually use a rule, never take an opponent's piece, of course, unless it's free. If it's a free piece, different story. But if I take someone, I know they're going to take me back. To me, it seems like a bit of a waste of time. I'll take them, they'll take me. What was the point of doing that? I may as well use my move for something a bit more constructive. All right, so black's now played bishop takes bishop. I've got 2 pawns. Karpov has 2 pawns to choose from to take back with. Do we choose the H pawn or the F pawn? And let's just type that in. You can just chat that to me. The H pawn or the F pawn, which pawn would you use to take that bishop? All right? Which pawn would you use? And we've got Anthony, Nicole, Andrew and Michael. Which pawn are you choosing? And Andrew's chosen a pawn as well. Michael, what are you choosing? Michael, which pawn? Would you use the F pawn to take the bishop or the H pawn? I'll give you another 10 seconds in case you're not hearing me. All right, so far, everybody's chosen to take with the F pawn. Yep, and I'm guessing that you want to take with that F pawn because you want to open up the rook and get your rook into the action, get an open file for your rook. Okay, that is good to get your rook into an open file, but much more important to follow the strategy, always capture towards the center. Okay, Karpov plays pawn from H, takes the bishop, because it's getting his pawns closer to the middle of the board. This pawn on F2 still covers the E3 square. The pawn on G3 covers the F4 square. So he's protecting squares that are closer to the middle rather than recapturing the other way, and you'd only be protecting the pawn out on the edge of the board. So more important even than opening up that file for the rook is to get your pieces your pawns closer to the middle, and that's an important rule. Always capture with a pawn towards the center. The other thing about capturing with the f-pawn that I don't like is that it opens up your king to attacks along the nasty black diagonal. All right, so I'm not really a fan of having my king wide open along that diagonal. I don't feel that the king is open now, because taking back with the h-pawn, there's no open files or open lines that you can use to attack. Right? White's king is still well protected by his pawns. Okay, the double pawns there, I don't think that they're a weakness at all. I think actually that for white, that's probably a strength. I would rather have double pawns in front of my king here. It's more protection for my king and closer to the center of the board, and certainly no weaknesses. There's no open files. It's not like black's going to be able to get an open H file and charge his rook and queen down there and checkmate you. Okay, and you can tell that because the center of the board is wide open. Right? If the center was really blocked up, it might be possible for black to do that. But with an open center like it is now, black's got no chance of doing that move. All right, so he's taken back with the h-pawn, and now black has played that move, bishop to g4, that we thought he should have played probably a little bit earlier to save himself some time. Okay, after bishop to g4 pinning the knight, white still needs a few more pieces developed into the attack. Remember, Karpov's the master of small advantages. Have we lost you, Michael? Karpov's the master of small advantages. So what he's going to be doing is trying to get all of his pieces into slightly better positions than his opponent's pieces. That's all he needs. So he's got to get all of his pieces into good positions. Next one, rook to e1. Stick a rook on an open file. Okay, it's got to be a good move. Putting a rook onto an open file, like everybody wanted to do before with the f-pawn, but this hasn't opened up the king at all. So rook e1's a good move. Black plays rook to d8, and you can see black's plan is to try and shove that pawn forwards. If he can advance that d-pawn, he's going to get even more control over the center, and his attack he's hoping his attack's going to come towards the king, although white's king's looking pretty safe at the moment. All right, rook to d8, white's next move. Who wants to try and have a guess? Just type in a move, send it to everybody or just to me, whatever you like. Type in a move and tell me what you think white's next move might be in this position. Right, strategy should be pretty simple. Hasn't changed from the first 6 moves of the game. Anthony suggested a move. Queen to d3 is Anthony's suggestion. Yeah, not a bad idea. Developing another piece, getting the queen off the back row, preparing your rook from a1 to come into the attack. Main strategy, of course, is to try and cover the d4 square. So queen to d3 does that because it unpins the knight. Queen to d2 as well does the same thing. Basically what Anthony's saying is unpin the knight on f3 so the knight still covers the d4 square. Any other suggestions apart from moving the queen and unpinning the knight? Any other suggestions? Type in some moves if you've got another suggestion for me. Anthony's got a suggestion. Michael? I know I'm dropping out a bit. Tonight must be a bad night for the internet. Sorry about that. But if I drop out, yeah, I'm dropping out from time to time, but just see if you can tell me. Just type it in. I'm not talking at the moment. I'm just waiting for people to type in some moves. Anthony's suggested another move, which is actually, Anthony, a much better move. That's a good move. So, Michael, have you got a suggestion for us? Any suggestions? White's turn to move. What's white going to do? Okay, let me just try and close that down. Let's see what I can do. Okay, I'm hoping that we can improve the quality of the sound. Okay, Michael's got a suggestion of moving the knight into the attack. Knight into the attack as well. The reason that I don't want to play knight to c5 is that that gives less control over the d4 square. I want to get more control over d4, and moving the knight gives you less. Knight to d4 is a good idea. Knight to d4 is a good idea, and queen to d2 are good ideas. Putting the knight on d4 allows some exchanges to happen. The move that white played is actually played pawn to c3, and there's a few reasons. Okay, one, control over d4. Okay. Yep. Two, like Anthony's just said to me, makes your bishop a good bishop because it's now got bishop on white squares, pawns mostly on black squares. Number three, makes it harder for black to attack on the c-file. Previously, black's queen could come down and attack white's weak pawn on c2 down the c-file. Now the pawn from c2 has moved forwards to c3, which puts it into sort of like a micro pawn chain, and that pawn on c3 is a lot harder for black to attack. So there's a few reasons that that move is a really good move. Main thing though, it's controlling d4. That's the main thing that we're trying to do in this position. All right. Black played queen to b6, and white retreated his bishop. Now, black's obviously trying for a kingside attack, or trying to advance his pawn forwards from d5 to d4. All right, that's the only way that black can win this game. All right, or even trying to get a draw. At the moment, it looks like white's king has got no chance of being attacked. It's very well protected. Black's got no pieces nearby. So black's only plan really now is to try and advance the pawn to d4. So that's what queen b6 attacking the bishop was all about, trying to advance the pawn to b4. Okay, now if the pawn does advance to d4 on this move, which is possible, you can move that pawn forwards to d4, white will not swap off pawn for pawn. Okay, if the pawn moves forwards to d4, white's just going to play pawn to c4. And black will still have an isolated queen's pawn, but the isolated pawn is now going to be on d4 instead of d5, and white's got heaps of pieces stopping that pawn from moving forwards even more. So eventually the pawn that's on d4, because it hasn't been swapped off, will just get weaker, and as it gets weaker, eventually it will get taken. So black chose not to play pawn to d4 now, even though that is his long-term plan, because he doesn't want to play the pawn forwards there if he can't swap it off. So instead he plays knight to g6. Now, I don't know if any of you know the strategy of knights, but if you've got a knight on a square like g6, and then you count 1, 2 squares, and then a pawn, the pawn on g3 basically cancels out all of the squares, all the good squares that that knight can go to. Okay, because you see the pawn covers the two main squares that black's knight would be moving to if he moves forwards. So putting that knight on g6 doesn't put his knight in a very good position because it's sort of stopped by the pawn. You might also notice that black's other knight is stopped from moving forwards by the pawn on c3 as well. So both of those knights are now in awkward positions. Yes, Anthony said that they can move to e5, but it's a lot slower to move sideways rather than moving forwards. So actually both of Black's knights are in not great positions. They'd both rather be able to move forwards. Doesn't mean they have to actually move forwards. They don't have to actually do that, but you've got to be able to do that if you wanted to. Okay, so both of Black's knights are in probably second best positions. They're not really in the best spots because they're restricted in their movements. They can't move to every square that they would normally like to move to. All right, queen to c2. Interesting move for White, allowing the move that Black actually suggests, that Black actually plays here, allowing bishop takes knight, and now White has to have double pawns again. All right, who wants to tell me about double pawns being on the G file or double pawns on the F file? Which is one better or worse? Does it make a difference? Who wants to tell me about those? All right, Anthony, have a go.
Well, first of all, you just took again towards the center, and you're now controlling the E3 and E4 squares with the pawns on F2 and F3. It also it's still very, very safe because you might even want to like I'm looking very long term here, but you might end up having your king on G2.
Very good.
And possibly, and then even bringing your rooks onto the H file.
Excellent, excellent vision. Yeah, it's actually good for White to have his pawns on F3 and F2. All right, these double pawns are an example of good doubled pawns. You know, we've seen double pawns can be bad in the endgame because the one behind it can't move forwards. But these double pawns, look at all the squares that are being controlled by those pawns. Okay, so I would say that while Black thought that he was going to exchange bishop for knight and open up White's king a bit more, in actual fact, what he's done is made White's position a bit stronger. Bit more protection over the center of the board, a bit more control over the squares in front, and like Anthony said, you can always play king g2 and your king's still behind the pawns and very safe. All right, rook to d6. Obviously there are some alternatives there. The alternative really for Black, instead of rook to d6, is to push his pawn forwards to d4. All right, and let's just go back for a move and let's just have a quick look at the possibilities. If he moves pawn to d4, the plan that White was going to try before, pawn to c4, doesn't work out because Black can play knight to b4 and trade off White's good bishop. Okay, so that's not really great for White. But what White would play, and this is actually what Karpov suggested he would play, is Karpov suggested he would play then pawn to f4, and after exchanging pawn for pawn, Karpov felt that he would have a better position here because Black's knights are in really bad positions, right? They can't go to e5, they can't go forwards, those knights are really very awkward. And so Karpov felt that he could win this game just because his pieces were in slightly better positions and Black's knights were in awkward positions that couldn't really maneuver themselves very well. So that was his plan there, and that may have been somewhat better for Black, to try and at least get rid of the pawns and then play in the center of the board with his open files, rather than what happened in the game, which was rook to d6, and what Black's trying to do is force an attack on the king side, even though really there is no attack possible. There's no attack on the king side. All right, White plays pawn to f4. Like we saw, for the same reason as before, pawn to f4 is just a move which takes away a square from Black's knight. So Black's knights are now both in pretty ordinary positions, right? They can't move forwards at all. The only thing Black's knights can do is go backwards. So his pieces are in pretty bad positions, I would have to say. All right, Black plays rook to d8. And we have a look at this position and we say, well, White's done pretty much everything that he wanted to do from the opening. He's kept that pawn on d5 from moving forwards. He's got good control over d4. His rook on e1's on an open file. His bishop on d3 is on the opposite colour from all his pawns, so it's a good bishop. He's even got a bishop and a knight against two knights when you look at the minor pieces, and a bishop's a little bit stronger in an open position than a knight, and this is obviously a very open position. Compare that with Black's position. Black's got two rooks, both blocked in behind his own pawn, so his rooks can't do anything. His knights are both in really bad positions that can't move anywhere at all, and his only attacking piece really is the queen, and his queen's in an okay position. It's attacking towards the weak spot on f2, but it's not really threatening anything. It's not really doing anything because it's got no support from any of the other pieces. So Black's in trouble now. Right? If Black tries to play pawn to d4, right, hit this whole plan that we've been talking about for the whole game, advancing that pawn forwards to d4. If he tries to do that, White can respond with pawn to c4 and stop anything from happening. All right. Oops. Let's go back to here. So White wants to be able to stop pawn to d4 with pawn to c4 and stop any attack from Black, and Black's going to be squished up on the d file. All his pieces are going to be blocked in by his own pawn. And the way that he does that is he plays pawn to a3. Okay, because you can see that stops the knight coming to b4, so that if Black plays pawn forwards to d4, White can just move past it, pawn to c4, and Black's got every single piece that he owns protecting the pawn on d4, but none of them are actually doing anything. They're not attacking any of enemy pieces. And really, I just want to show you that, actually. It's a really nice position to see. You know, have a look at this position. Every single one of Black's pieces is protecting that pawn on d4, and White's not even attacking it. That's the beauty of this position, is that White is not even really attacking that pawn. He's got a knight attacking the pawn, and yet Black still feels like he needs queen, two rooks, and a knight to protect it. It's one pawn. It's the weakest piece on the board, and yet Black's using his entire army to defend a pawn that's barely even attacked. I think that's classic. I think that's just great Karpov play. All right. So, White's now starting to think, which of my pieces needs to get into a better position? All right, which piece needs to get to a better position? And the one piece that you could say could be in a better position would be perhaps the knight on b3. Right? Because if the knight on b3 was instead on d4 safely, or even better, on f3, it would do all the same things, stops the pawn from moving forwards, but it's in a better position. It's controlling more squares. It's not vulnerable to attack like where it is at the moment from the queen. So White's plan is going to be to just try and reposition his knight. All right, let's see what Black does. h4 for Black, forcing himself to attack. There's no attack there. If we look at the king side, Black's pieces aren't there. Black's got a knight, which can't even really move forwards, trying to attack a king, and it's just too easy for White to defend. There is just no attack coming. King to g2, remember that was one of Anthony's suggestions before, was to move the king forwards to g2 and maybe even get the rooks onto the h-file. And what you'll find now is that when Black keeps on going with this supposed attack of his, pawn to h4, opening up the h-file actually ends up giving White more of an attack than Black, because White can get his pieces onto the h-file much more easily than Black can. All right, rook to e2, doing a multi-purpose move. Rook to e2 is a clever multi-purpose move. It allows his rook to move on to, from a1 to move on to e1, doubling rooks up onto the open file, and it allows his rook to come across to h1 and jump onto the h-file. So he's got choices. He can go either way. Now this is starting to look bad. When your opponent's got no other move but to retreat a knight that's not attacked, right, knight f8, you know that something's going wrong for Black, right? The beauty of this game is that White hasn't even threatened anything. This is what I love about this game. White hasn't threatened anything. He's just put his pieces in slightly better squares. He's just thinking, oh, how am I going to reposition my knight from b3 onto f3? That's a good spot. How do I put my rooks onto better positions? Make sure my bishop's on the opposite color for my pawns, right? All these really simple strategic ideas. Hasn't threatened something, and already Black's retreating. Black's using his entire army to protect a pawn. He's retreating his knight. You'd think he was under attack, but he's not. He's not attacked at all. All right, knight d2, perfectly safe now to move his knight back and reposition it onto f3. All right, rook to h6. Like we've said, what Black's trying to do is get an attack going against the king, but there's no chance. It's just not going to happen. White's got an equal number of pieces on that side of the board, so he can't get through. Now the knight's on f3. If Black plays pawn to h3, check, king just moves on to h2. Black's got no more attack coming down, and probably the h-pawn's going to die. Okay, that h-pawn's not going to be able to protect himself. Right? He can't just leave it there because it's going to get taken for nothing. So the only thing he can do now is to swap off pawn for pawn, right, which is actually going to leave the open file on the h file for White to attack. Right? This is just great. All right, knight to d7. Black's knight still trying to reposition itself to get into a position where it can attack something. But, it takes a long time for a knight to get back into a good position, and it's just not coordinated with any of his other pieces. All right, Karpov doubles rooks up on the open file. Pretty logical move, doubling up on the open file. Every single one of his pieces in good positions. King to f8. He doesn't want the rook obviously coming down to the back row. The whole point of controlling an open file is to infiltrate on one of those two squares at the end of the board. Okay, so Karpov can't let the rook come to e8. Sorry, Kuzmin can't let the rook come to e8, because if Karpov's rook gets to the back row, Karpov's in all sorts of great things are happening for him. His rook's attacking. But still, he's got to try and get his rook onto one of those two squares down the edge of the board. That's White's plan. Pawn to g4. You'll have never seen an attack like this before. This is insane. White's king is wide open, but he's moving his pawns forwards to attack down the board simply because Black's pieces are all uncoordinated. Right? His pieces can't really go anywhere. He can't attack White's king. All right? White's got no pawns covering his king, but Black can't attack him. So it's actually safe. Queen to f4, trying to threaten some stuff, but you know what? Threatening that pawn for Black, if that's the best he's got in this game, it's real trouble. It's real trouble. All right. White keeps on going. Pawn to g5 with the attack, chasing Black's pieces backwards. Rook to h8. And here is where I promised you some waddling that was going to happen. What's our waddling move in this position? All right, Black is threatening that pawn on f4, but it can easily be protected. So what's our waddling move? Hey, Anthony's got it. King to g3. We love just waddling our king up the board. It's crazy. The king is actually attacking. The king is waddling up the board, helping control squares, protecting the pawns, and Black can't create any open files. Black can't get an attack against White. All right. The other beautiful thing about king to g3 you might have noticed is that it opens up laterally the rook to come across onto the h file. So every single one of White's pieces is just in a beautiful position. All right, here's Black's last hope. Throws his knight over to c5, hoping that there'll be something happening. Bishop moves out of the way. Why would you swap off a good bishop for a knight? Bishop to f5, unless you've got a good reason. You're not going to swap off pieces. Pawn to g6, and now pawn to b4. All right. If Black now retreats the knight, White's going to play bishop takes g6 and get this crushing attack down here. And this is looking pretty good. All right. Don't know that there's anything that Black can do to stop all of white's threats in this position. Basically, white's got rook to e8 next move as a threat, and I mean, really, there's nothing that black can do about that. So that's that's white's sacrifice if the knight retreats. If the knight doesn't retreat, he's got to play knight to e4 check, which is ending up losing a pawn, and as he loses material, he just gets worse and worse. So bishop takes. Quite happy to swap off a piece for a good bishop for a knight if we're going to get an extra pawn out of it. And there's our extra pawn. And it's not like the attack's slowed down because he's taken a pawn. You can see he's still taking a pawn and advancing. His queen's now tripled up on the open file. Right? His knight's in a great position, and still black's knight over here on c6 can't advance forwards because the pawn on c3 just knocks it out of the game. So Karpov takes a pawn and accelerates the attack. Right, king to g7 for black. Well, he's got to try and get his rooks into the game. You know, he spent all this time getting his rook from h8 into the attack on the d file, moved it round back to the h file and back to h8, and now he's coming around in another circle. So black's just been going around in circles here. Pawn to b5, hitting the knight, forcing the knight out of the way. Bad position over on the edge of the board, and then plonking the queen down on e7, forcing an exchange of queens. Right, the queen can't risk taking that pawn on c3 because, well, I'll just show you the variation. If the queen takes this on c3, rook will come up and hit the queen. Right, just defending that third rank. Queen moves out of the way, so that it's not on the third row in front of the king anymore. Rook to e5, and next move, queen f6, and it's all over. Black's getting checkmated either with one of the rooks coming to the h file or coming down to the end of the board. All right, so rook to e5, and yeah, white's got all the pieces attacking, black's king's, well, it's all over. All right, so let's go back here, and you see that now black's got to swap off queen for queen. And again, white's trading pieces because he's ahead. It's an end game, so he's a pawn ahead. He wants to try and trade off pieces. But he's not just trading off pieces and losing time. He's trading off pieces by forcing black to take him so that he can then get an extra move. He can bring his rook into the attack, right, gaining an extra move. Right? So this is the brilliance of this game, is that every move that white plays, it seems like he's just got every piece working perfectly. All right, black's got a chance. He's coming with his rook down to attack. Not going to help much. Rook to c7. White's rooks are about to double up on the e file. His rooks are going to then just munch up everything along the everything along the 7th rank, not just f7, but everything on the 7th rank is going to get munched. Knight to b3. Small threat, little tactic. He wants to play knight d2, attacking the pinned piece on f3, so we can just waddle a bit more. That king can just waddle up to g4. All of white's pieces still attacking perfectly, and black's just uncoordinated. You know, what is this? Rook f8. It's a terrible place for a rook to be. Rook to e7, and you know, black actually resigned here, but just as an example of what could happen, I mean, the knight's about to come in onto e5, but just as a sort of a simple example, black might play something like knight to d2, trying to trade off. White could play something like swap, 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 swap.
Yeah, well, it's still going, so...
Check. Oh, hi, Michael. You came back. Sorry about that. Swap everything off. King moves out of the way, and you're now just, you know, 2 pawns ahead, and basically very simple for white's pawn on the g file just to zoom down and queen. All right. So we've run a bit over time as usual, but only by a couple of minutes, which is good. Main things I want you to take away from that game, the main things to learn about isolated queen's pawn. When you've got an isolated queen's pawn, or your opponent's got an isolated queen's pawn, step 1, protect the square in front of the pawn. Right? First, blockade the pawn, stop it from moving forwards. Then, step 2, attack it. We saw some great strategy on the open file. We saw some really good piece placement. I particularly like the way that the pawns stopped those knights, and that destroyed him there. You will have a section called Materials, and you'll be able to see this as a PDF, so you can download the file, which shows you the moves of the game and some of the comments, so you can have a look at it yourself. That'll also be part of the materials when you log in again next time. So that's the lesson for tonight. If there are any questions, I'm hanging around for a few minutes for some questions.
I definitely liked the waddling.
Good, Anthony. I'm glad you liked the waddling. All right, if there's no more questions, lesson's over. Thanks, guys.
Okay, not in terms of that one, but in terms of starting my